Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a Solar Titan build. It's one I'm very excited to share with you because I personally put this build on the same level as Bonk Titan. It's one that features a base 68% damage boost to any solar gun in the game. On top of that, we have constant cure and restoration effects, contributing to some great survivability on this build, even if we don't have the highest base damage resistance. Keep in mind that all the gameplay and background footage you're seeing today is solo play, and this build gets even better with the fire team. So without any delay, let's get right into it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like any of the content you see here today, and let me know what you want to see next down below. Starting off in the subclass, you can really use either super you want. Either Burning Maul or Hammer of Soul works perfectly great with this build. It's totally down to personal preference. For abilities, I'm going with Throwing Hammer. Now the main reason we're using this is just because it's a pseudo infinite melee. It also has a lower cooldown compared to Hammer Strike. On top of that, the Throwing Hammer is basically an infinite source of cure as well. So it just works a lot better with various aspects of this build, considering the fact that you can't technically have it forever. And on top of that, we're also using a Firebolt grenade. Not only is this one of the fastest base cooldowns of any grenade in the entire game, but it has a lot more potential focused with it because of seasonal mods that we'll get into later. The first aspect we're using is Soul Invictus, and this is the one I absolutely recommend using for this build, no matter what combination you go with. Basically, anytime you have a solar ability Final Blow, a Hammer of Soul impact, or defeat a scorched enemy, it'll create a sunspot. These sunspots not only deal an AoE scorching damage to enemies that enter it, but when you enter it, you get a slight boost to your ability regen, and then you also have restoration effects applied to you. For those who don't know, restoration is one of the best effects in the entire game, and it's basically just a constant healing buff that'll even heal as you take damage. For the other aspect, you can use Consecration or Roaring Flames. Roaring Flames will be better for a more ability-focused build, and since this is deviating away from your typical Hammer Bonk ability spam that's found on Solar 3.0 Titan, I decided to go with Consecration just so we have a nice burst DPS option, and with the ability regen that this build already has built into it, it's really easy for us to get our melee back after we use it with Consecration, meaning that even though we are giving up our Throwing Hammer, we can get it back almost instantaneously. For our fragments, I'm going with Ember of Resolve. Basically, anytime you get a Final Blow with your grenade, it'll grant Cure, and again, this stacks on top of all the other cure effects that we can proc with this build. I'm also using Ember of Char, which any ignition that we create spreads scorch stacks to nearby targets. Ember of Empyrean, which any solar weapon or solar ability Final Blow extends the restoration and radi effects that we have applied to us. This means that we can basically always have restoration up as long as we're getting kills. And then we're also using Ember of Searing, and anytime you defeat a scorched target, it grants you melee energy back and also creates a Fire Sprite. And Fire Sprites are just basically a new version of Solar Elemental Wells, and they also have a few other effects that we'll get into later thanks to the seasonal artifact. I do want to note that if you're in higher difficulty content, it is worth swapping out Ember of Resolve for Ember of Torches. Although we won't really be needing the Radiant weapon buff, having that Radiant effect is also really good at just dealing with barrier champions if you don't have a weapon that already can. But just keep that in mind, you can swap either of these out based on whatever content or playstyle you go with. Onto the armor and the mods then. For our helmet, the first thing we're using is Harmonic Siphon, and this allows any rapid solar weapon Final Blow that we do to generate an orb of power. I'm also using a stack of heavy ammo and special ammo finder. If you want to swap this around because you're playing with a fire team, or if you want to rock a scout or just dual specific kinds of finders, you can based on your playstyle and your weapon choice. For our gauntlets, I'm using Impact Induction. This allows any damage that we cause with our melee attack to reduce our grenade cooldown, and this can work both with our Throwing Hammer and our Consecration melee ability, and this is a great way to contribute to the overall grenade regen that this build already has naturally built into it. On top of this, I'm using Momentum Transfer, which allows any damage that our grenade does to in turn regen our melee, allowing for a regen chain across both of our abilities. Keep in mind, we also have something like Ember of Searing, where anytime we defeat a scorched target, it grants us melee energy and generates a Fire Sprite, and that Fire Sprite, which we can then generate through multiple sources, also allows us to have grenade energy whenever we pick it up. This means that across both with very little investment, we can basically have a constant grenade and melee regen across the board, contributing to the ignition and scorching effect that this build thrives off of. I'm also using a solar loader to benefit our solar weapons with this build. If you want to swap this out for another stack of Impact Induction or Momentum Transfer, you can. For a chest piece, I'm using Charged Up. This allows you to carry an additional stack of armor charge up to 4 from the 3 base stacks. I'm also using Solar Reserves just to benefit our heavy weapon as well as our special weapon, and then any kind of resistance mod based on the activity you're in works perfectly fine. If you wanted to though, you could double down on Charged Up and rock 2, even 3 stacks depending on what level of content you're in. Onto our exotic, and our legs for today are the Path of Burning Steps. These exotic allow any solar Final Blows, whether that's from a weapon or an ability, to grant you an escalating bonus to weapon damage specifically. And in just some specific aspects, you're harder to slow or freeze with stasis, and when you break out, you take no damage from yourself, and you create a small burst of solar energy. While that second portion is mainly relevant to PvP, the main thing we're focusing on are the stacks of Firewalker that you get from periodic solar Final Blows. Now, Firewalker actually replaces your Empowering buff, which is why I wouldn't typically recommend using something like Radiant with this build, and because it takes the place of your Empowering buff, it means it doesn't work with things like Well of Radiance or Weapons of Light. However, the damage bonus that you get at ×4 stacks is a 40% damage buff to your solar weapons. This is far more than Radiant, and this is far more than Weapons of Light. In fact, it's the exact same buff that you get from Banner Shield, meaning it's one of the highest empowering buffs in the entire game. And the only thing you need to do to keep it up is just to keep getting solar kills. So as long as there are enemies to kill, you can basically have this buff indefinitely. And we're going to make this buff even more potent by stacking on top 2 stacks of solar weapon surge. You can do 3 if you want to. I would recommend having the third either be something like stacks on stacks, which grant you an additional stack of armor charge for every overpower you pick up, and that also works with something like solar surge. Or in my case, I'm using a solar scavenger just to benefit our heavy and special weapon. With 2 stacks of solar weapon surge, we get an additional 15% damage bonus, and with these 2 stacks alone plus ×4 firewalker, it allows any solar weapon in the entire game to have a base 68% damage buff applied to it. I say a base buff because depending on what you choose with different weapon perks or different abilities, it may allow that buff to go even further, and I'll showcase how I actually do that later on. But this means things like Lament will do at base 68% more damage. It means things like Parasite, which is actually the exotic I went with for today, will do at base 68% more damage. Any solar weapon, legendary or exotic, is going to hit way harder with this build. And then finally onto our mark, the first 2 mods are Time Dilation, and with these stacks, it'll bring the surge effect that we can experience through our solar weapon surge mods to 18 seconds instead of 10. And then for the final mod, you can use whatever you want. You can use a 3rd stack of Time Dilation if you want to. I'm personally using Special Finisher just to have a constant supply of special ammo for us and our fire team. And even though it takes 3 stacks of armor charge, we can hold up to 4. We have tons of orbs of power and then also fire sprite generation with this build, meaning that we have constant supplies of armor charge whenever we need them. Onto the seasonal mods, the first one we're using is Solar Surge. Anytime they pick up a fire sprite, it acts like an orb of power and grants you 1 stack of armor charge. This is a fantastic mod because Firebolt grenades are already really spammable with their lower tier cooldown, and with this, not only does it help with the grenade energy regen by picking up that fire sprite, but it also grants you a stack of armor charge. The next one is Flare Up, and this allows your Firebolt grenade to apply more scorch stacks on hit, and anytime that you damage a combatant with a Firebolt grenade, a fire sprite spawns on them, and we already went over how good those can be on their own. You also have Random Firebolts, which anytime you equip a Firebolt grenade, you get a 2nd grenade charge, just simply doubling our grenades for free. You also have Prismatic Transfer, which whenever you cast your super, each member of your fire team with a subclass different than yours, so this includes Arc, Void, Strand, and Stasis, they get a bonus to weapon damage. Now, the weapon damage bonus from this is 20%, and it will take up your empowering buff, so this means that it won't stack with things like Well or Radiant or Bubble, for example, and it's only really there to kind of serve as a bonus for us when we play with a fire team. It's not necessary for this build, so if you want to rock something else instead, go for that. Onto the weapons with this build, your primary weapon really doesn't matter. In fact, if you wanted to, you could rock double specials like I am, but really any primary weapon that you like using, especially if it's a solar primary or an exotic solar primary like Sunshot, for example, it'll work fantastic with this build. For your special weapon, I have a few specific recommendations. The first is Retrace Path. This is craftable from Dares of Eternity, and there are a number of roles you can actually go with on this weapon to make it extremely good with this build. For my role, I crafted Enhanced Subsistence and Enhanced Golden Tricorn. For Enhanced Subsistence, it just allows us to get a little bit of ammo back every time we get a kill with this weapon, and the enhanced version just simply grants us more ammo. With Enhanced Golden Tricorn, anytime that we get a final blow with this weapon, it'll increase the damage it does by 15% for 7 seconds. This honestly isn't the greatest damage buff out of all the ones we could get with this weapon, but the reason we're doing it is anytime that you get a matching grenade or powered melee kill, so using our Firebolt grenade or using our throwing hammer or our concentration melee ability, it'll turn this 15% buff into a 50% buff. Now, this 50% buff can't be refreshed on getting a kill with the weapon, but it can be refreshed by getting a kill with an ability. Again, our Firebolt grenade, throwing hammer melee, or consecration melee. And because this build already has a lot of natural ability synergy built into it, this means that we can effectively have this up constantly. On top of this, I'm stacking on top a minor spec just to help with the add clear potential of this weapon. And this means that with this entire build, this weapon has an almost 170% damage buff active at all times. This is being boosted by our exotic, which grants a 40% buff. This is being boosted by Golden Tricorn, which grants a 15 and then 50% buff. This is being enhanced by 2 stacks of Solar Surge, which are a 15% buff, and a minor spec, which is a 7% buff. And on top of this, if you didn't want to go with Golden Tricorn, there are other great options as well in this column. You could also do something like Incandescent and just playing off of the Scorch benefits this build already has. You can do something like Frenzy, which is a 15% constant buff as long as you're in combat. And you could even equip Demolitionist if you want to go fully into the grenade regen this build has to offer. But again, guys, literally any solar weapon works fantastic. Something like the Aquilos shotgun with Trench Barrel absolutely shreds with this build. The Callus mini tool is a fantastic option as well. For other exotics, I'd also recommend using Lord of Wolves and Teraba absolutely shred in PvE content. Prometheus Lens is a solar exotic trace rifle that I also highly recommend. Plus, while you deal consistent damage with this weapon, it also applies Scorch stacks, meaning that it has ability synergy already built into it. And then finally, for your power weapon, There are really a lot of options you could do with this build. You could always go with something like Galahorn, for example, which is one of the best heavy weapons in the entire game. Cataclysmic, which is something that's been in the meta for a long time, gets even crazier with this build. Again, I mentioned Lament earlier, which is an absolute DPS monster with this build. The main one I want to focus on is Parasite. Now, the reason for this is Parasite is already a grenade launcher that specializes in dealing high damage in a single shot. As you can imagine, pairing a 68% buff with this weapon makes it absolutely disgusting. After getting 20 kills while this weapon is stowed, swapping to it will grant the next shot an immense damage boost. So whenever we combine Worm's Hunger with our Solar Weapon Surge as well as our Firewalker stacks, this thing can push well over 1,000,000 damage in a single shot depending on your activity. And again, if Solar Surge is a modifier in your activity, this weapon will then deal an additional 25% on top of that. So with the right week and the right activity, this weapon is an absolute monster, and I cannot recommend it enough. And if you wanted to, we also have Worm Byproduct, which anytime you take damage with this weapon, you actually empower your weapons for a short time. This empowerment buff is less than our Firewalker buff, and so it will be overpowered eventually, but it's a nice way to get the build going if you don't have any other stacks or stacks of armor charge to go off of. Anyway, guys, that's the build. Like I said earlier, it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time and just haven't been able to do it because there weren't really any good seasonal mods that made a build like this truly shine. But with this season and the just overall abundance and potency of Firebolt grenades and the new Fire Sprite reworks, I figured it's a great time to showcase this build and all the crazy potential it already has. Like I mentioned earlier, this entire build was made and showcased around solo gameplay. So if you're playing with a fire team, the build gets even better because not only can you have a lot more support with your fire team and a lot more orb gems to support your own build, but if someone's rocking, say, Tether, for example, all of the damage that I'm showcasing you is increased by 30%, meaning that Parasite gets even stronger, if that was even possible. All in all, thank you guys so much for watching the build. I greatly appreciate the continued support on these videos. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of it down below, as well as any recommendations for future build guides. Thank you guys so much for watching. I greatly appreciate the continued support, and have a great day.